Hi, my name is Alex, and in this episode of Magic Missile Minis, I'm going to be doing a Space Marine conversion. So, a while back I got this set of miniatures, the Space Marine Tactical Squad, and I was trying to figure out how I wanted to paint them. Unfortunately, none of the classic Space Marine types or chapters, as they're called, were really jumping out to me or interested me that much. So I decided that I would try and make my own, and I was trying to come up with a good theme, and I thought it would be kind of cool to do a Lovecraftian-themed Space Marine chapter, kind of based off of Lovecraftian horror and different monsters, and primarily Cthulhu, obviously, for those of you who are familiar with Lovecraftian horror. And so I started by painting a bunch of them just in my free time and trying to figure out what kind of color scheme I wanted to do. And now that I've kind of honed in on what I want to do for painting them, I decided that I would videotape me doing a conversion, adding a bunch of green stuff to create my own emblems, designs, and that sort of a thing. So with that little bit of exposition out of the way, here is the video. So I start by figuring out what pieces I'm going to want, and then go ahead and remove them from the sprue with some wire cutters. And then I go ahead and clean up all the different pieces that I've chosen, using a craft knife to cut off all the extra little bits of the sprue that are left over, and then using that same craft knife to get rid of any mold lines. And then I move on to do a little bit of assembling, putting those other pieces on wires and attaching them to their own little handles that I'm going to use to work on them with. And as one last part of this kind of cleaning up stage, I go ahead and put a little hole into the barrel of the gun he is going to be using. And with that, the miniature is ready for the actual conversion. The first thing I decide to work on is the Power Fist. And as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, I wanted to have a Lovecraftian theme for this Space Marine. So I decided I would keep the skull on the Power Fist, but wanted to add some stuff to it that I'll get to later. And so as you can see here, with a combination of slicing and filing, I get rid of the other designs that were on the Power Fist, giving me a nice blank canvas that I can start adding stuff to. And the design that I mentioned wanting to add earlier is going to be a kind of Cthulhu type tentacle-y skull. So here you can see me adding a little bit of green stuff, making sure that it actually is sticking to the plastic, and then sculpting that out with my craft knife and other sculpting tools. And while these details are fairly large, I did another video on sculpting fine details using this same method, and there should be a link to that in the card. As I was working on this, I was realizing that something just wasn't looking quite right. And after looking at some other like Cthulhu type designs, I realized these tentacles were actually curling in the wrong direction. So I quickly go ahead and change that. With that where I like it, I go ahead and start adding some more of these tentacles, adding 2 more on either side that curl down, and then 2 more on either side that curl up. They're a little bit smaller than the other 4. I wanted this symbol to appear through other parts of the miniature as a kind of emblem for the Space Marine chapter. So I go ahead and add some green stuff to this backpack so that I have a little bit more real estate to add this design, doing my best to make it as seamless as possible. And after that's set, I add the same design to the skull that I did before, trying to get it as similar to the design I added to the Power Fist as I possibly can. I also wanted this design to be on one of the Space Marine's pauldrons. So I start by adding a little bit of green stuff to the little cavity that's normally in the pauldrons. And while that sets, I go ahead and take one of the toppers they have for like a flagpole and remove the kind of wreath that they had around it so it's just the skull. I then file down the pauldron to make a little flat space where I can stick this guy, using a really small piece of green stuff to attach the skull to the pauldron. I then clean up the edges with a sculpting tool, and once again go back in with the skull design that I've been adding around the entirety of the miniature. I wanted to change where the position of the other arm was going to be in, so here you can see me taking some green stuff and using that to attach the arm to the miniature. I then also go ahead and add some pipes to the kind of mask this guy was wearing to give it a little bit more of a tentacle-y kind of Cthulhu vibe. And then go ahead and add one of the other kind of flag toppers onto the backpack of this guy with a little bit of green stuff. With everything set, I go ahead and assemble all these pieces that I've been working on, filing down any parts that need to be attached to one another so that when I add some super glue, it actually sticks better. And after a bunch of finagling and gluing my fingers together, the Mini is finally assembled. Now I can give you a view of the entire miniature with all of the green stuff that I've added. And now I can finally get to painting the miniature. And here is the Mini now that it is primed. And I've been really looking forward to painting this Mini while I've been doing the conversion and assembling it, because I've always loved painting Space Marines because of their large, bold shapes. I start the painting process by adding a base layer of the armor color that I want to use, which in this case is a kind of like an oxidized copper green, going over the entirety of the miniature with 2 thin coats of this color. Now we can move on to the shading, which is the main reason I love the bold shapes of the Space Marines. I start by adding in a slightly darker tone into where I want the shadows to be, and then go ahead with my main armor color and blend those together while both paints are still wet. I do that around the entirety of the miniature and then go again with an even darker tone, blending that with the shadow tone that I was using in my first layer of shadow, moving on to do that around the rest of the Mini as well. I then move on to add some highlights. Starting with my highlight color, simply adding a dot or line where I want the lightest point to be, and then using a painting technique called glazing, I create a gradient from that highlight. For those of you who don't know, glazing is basically taking a watered down paint, putting it onto where you want the gradient to be, then blending it out with another brush, and doing this over and over and over again until it has a nice gradient. Once I've sorted out all of the glazing, I go ahead and do some edge highlighting, adding a thin line of the highlight color I was using before to the edge of all the armor bits that are facing the light source that I have chosen for this miniature. I then move on to add some of the metallics, adding a silver metallic around the miniature, and as you can see here, I add a reddish bronze for the skull tentacle things that I've added, as well as some of the other details. As you can see, this little bullet that seems to be hanging off of his pauldron, as well as the emblem on his chest and the skull that's kind of sitting on his jetpack backpack thing. I then go ahead and do some more edge highlighting, but on all of the metallics, using a slightly silver gold for this highlight. As well as this edge highlighting, I go ahead and just paint on a highlight on the emblems that I was creating, making sure to add these highlights in keeping with my light source. Doing these highlights on all of your medals are really going to give the person looking at your Mini a sense of where the light is coming from. I also go onto the emblem that he has on his chest with that same color, but simply dry brush that on. I then go ahead and do the same thing I did on the gold medal, but on the more gun medal that I have for his mask and on his gun. After that, I can move on to do his face, adding a flesh tone. I then move on to paint the other parts of the miniature. Like here you can see the loincloth, as well as the wax seals that the Space Marines have. And I go ahead to paint those wax seals a purple, in keeping with the Lovecraftian theme. And then I go and add some little lines onto the wax seals as well, to stand in for what would be writing. I then go in and paint in the eyes as carefully as I possibly can, and can then move on to do some weathering. Here I start by adding a little bit of brown to the loincloth to simulate some kind of dirt. Then also do a little bit of paint chipping on the armor, adding a little bit of the gunmetal I've been using before, painting that into the edges here of the pauldron, as you can see, doing my best to be as random as possible. Going to do that around the rest of the miniature as well. And then as a final touch for the weathering, I add a little bit of my highlight color to around the edge of where the paint would be chipping. With that done, I can move on to the washes, and this will help the metal look a little bit worn and old. I make sure to take special care as I do all of the emblems in this, making sure I get all of the crevices black the way that I want them to be. I also add a little bit of this brown wash to the bottom of the loincloth, wiping it off rather quickly to add to the muddy feel of the loincloth. I then go ahead and add my flesh tone wash to the face of the mini. I unfortunately don't have a proper one, so I have to use a slightly more intense wash than I would like to have since I mixed this one myself, so I'll go and wipe that off with a brush as needed. And then as a final wash, I go over the entire mini with a nice thick coating of Nuln Oil. And for those of you who don't know, that's basically just a very, very pitch black wash that will shade everything a little bit and get into all of the crevices. And with that done, the miniature is finished. This project was really fun to work on. Doing a conversion is something that I've been thinking about doing for a while and just haven't gotten the chance to actually sit down and do. I will also say the paint job on this miniature is probably my favorite paint job that I've ever done on any of my miniatures. I really like how it turned out. It's not too bright, but it's also not too dark. It's just right in that butter zone for me. If you like that video, if you like the conversions, I've got other ideas for sets that I want to buy. And if you leave some comments or any feedback or that kind of a thing, this is my first conversion, that would be really cool as well. Just getting some tips. And again, if you guys want to see more, leave a comment, like the video. But anyways, I've rambled on enough. Once again, thank you so much for watching that video, and I'll see you in the next one.